Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rohrer. I'm at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, www.gracesf.com, where we worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. And this is
Pastor Dan Tisdale.
Sunday.
I am Pastor Dan Tisdale from First Lutheran of Gypsum, Colorado. And Gypsum is in the mountains of Colorado along I-70, halfway between Dale and Glenwood Springs. And we worship Sunday at 9 a.m. This Saturday, I'm just saying this, I don't even know if anyone watching this will be near there. But anyway, this Saturday we're having a big, giant yard sale to benefit the church. Not a yard sale. Why did I say that?
Auction.
We're having a silent auction to sell a bunch of furniture, really high-end, great furniture at from 9 to 3 here in town. You can check our Facebook page or our web page, which are both First Lutheran of Gypsum, all one word, for information about that or worship or anything else ever.
And it's Transfiguration Sunday, which is when Jesus turns really, really white. And so I've got this weird window lighting sometimes. So if you wonder why I'm the whitest I've ever been with all of the sunshine from the window, it's to celebrate Transfiguration Sunday. Transfiguration is a word that means that Jesus changes, transforms in the body, has a metamorphosis, looks different. In the reading that we're doing for this Sunday, it's from Mark's Gospel. It doesn't say in Mark's Gospel that Jesus's body changes. It just says that his clothes turn white and are like blue, like a commercial where all of a sudden your clothes are bleached, the brightest bright on earth. But in Matthew's account and in Luke's account, it says that Jesus's face changes, Jesus's being changes. It comes from a story about Moses, where Moses has this moment where he's so faithful that his like light shoots out of his head. Or if you've seen the statues that were created by Michelangelo, it looks like Moses has horns, and it's supposed to be light, but you can't see light in a sculpture, so it looks like horns. There is also a story that accompanies this that comes from 2 Kings about Elijah and Elisha, where they see like this chariot that's on fire and clothing is torn and ripped off. And that's kind of like what happens when you have a close encounter with God, this idea that something kind of cool happens. And so that's the kind of like white dark part of it, because these readings are coupled with 2 Corinthians, where it talks about being a slave for Jesus and there's slavery language in this. It's even more important that we state at the beginning of this Bible study that the imageries and the metaphors about light and darkness were stories that were told inside caves, like inside literal caves where it was dark and you needed light in order to be able to see what you were doing. The early Christians thought they were going to die all the time. So it wasn't a metaphor that was intended to be about skin color, but it is a metaphor that has done a lot of damage throughout American history when biblical references about slavery were used to justify slavery and were preached to slaves that they should obey their masters even when their masters were doing terrible things to them. And so I think it's important to like begin this Bible study by saying, if you are in a community and a context where metaphors about light and God turning white is not helpful, don't talk about them, right? Then your Sunday needs to be dedicated towards metaphors about darkness being beautiful and black being beautiful. And it should be said, if Jesus's face turns white, it wasn't white before that moment. Right. And so this idea that Jesus was white is a Western concept. It's not in early iconography. Early iconography, even in the Sistine Chapel, Mark is black too. And so try to divorce yourself from some of the like anti-Semitism and some of the racism that has been translated into the gospel these days. And the more you can state clearly that this is not a white power text, this is a text about hope conquering despair. And this is a text about Jesus says in sentence number 1, some of you will not die before you see God in your midst. And people translated that to mean all Christians, like this generation of Christians will not die. That's what Paul thought it meant. In the Gospel of Mark, it literally means in the next sentence, a cool thing's going to happen that proves that I am the Messiah. And it's not necessarily about any of the followers of Jesus and what they would encounter after that story moment. The Gospel of Mark goes really, really fast. Poof, this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And so it's literally in the Gospel of Mark, some of you won't die until you see that I'm the Messiah. Let's go up into a mountain. I am the Messiah. Whoa. Right? It's immediate. It's not a like prophecy about which generation God's going to come back in. And if you think about all of the stories that are tied together this week, it's a story of God changing, about God coming to people and showing them they're saved, not a story that requests that God's people change. Right? So Elijah and Elisha encounter the chariot that's on fire. God changes. It's a reference to Ezekiel's glowing wheel. When people are trying to climb up the Tower of Babel, they're trying to overthrow God from the heavens. And so God changes to be movable so that people can't throw God down from the throne and play king of the hill with God. Right? So God becomes mobile when it's needed. And that mobility of God is able to come to us when we need God, right? Not when we're trying to overthrow God, but when we need God. And this story of Jesus, particularly in a time when trans folk are getting kind of the political shaft, and as a person who has a trans body, is a time to talk about God's body changing. Jesus's body changes in his life, in his death, and in his resurrection. All of those times, there are moments within the Bible where people are like, what's going on with the dude's body? And there are words about metamorphosizing and changing that are really important to pay attention to. Not because I'm arguing that Jesus is transgender, although there's some really cool books that do talk about like, hey, if Jesus has 2 moms, the Holy Spirit and Mary, there's no Y chromosome in order for Jesus to be a boy. So what is Jesus? I'm not making that argument, but you can read about it if you want to. What I'm saying is that everyone has transition moments, whether you're transitioning through puberty, whether you're transitioning from a student to a professional, whether you're transforming from someone who's like not interested in telling your friends that you're a faithful person to someone who is going to be known as a Christian in the world. Or if it's a transformation from like making bad decisions to making better decisions. Everybody has transitions. In Jesus's story, they're physical changes, physical transfigurations. And so if you ever wanted a story that was going to celebrate and talk about Jesus's body and how spectacularly cool it is that it changes, this might be your opportunity. So you can talk about how beautiful it is that like wrinkles exist and how beautiful it is that like some people have dimples. And you can, the reason that I think talking about trans people in this text is better than talking about trans people in other texts, particularly the texts about the eunuchs. They're really cool Bible stories, but they involve like acknowledging genital crushing that might not have been the choice of the individual who experienced it, or it might have come from a gnarly accident. And it makes that person's label more important than the fact that they probably were really, really smart and the only ones who could read during that generation. And they were like the Ethiopian eunuch story in Acts is a story of a transgender person who is really smart and really resourced, but because we don't know that about eunuchs, most people read it as like, Philip had this great insight. Yay, more people can be saved by the gospel. When the Ethiopian eunuch was playing chess with Philip and was like, I read this scripture. I just happened to be carrying a scroll. By the way, no one owns scrolls or carries them around. You should baptize me. Oh, wow, you figured it out on your own, right? So I think the more we can celebrate moments like the Transfiguration as a trans moment, the less we have to focus on people's genital histories, because that's weird and probably not fun at everyday Bible studies. But also, this is a moment where Jesus's body changes and transfigures for the purpose of showing that Jesus is holy and connected to God. And so instead of it being a story about like a destruction or an inability to be fertile, it's a story of your holiness being revealed through this bodily change. So it's a liberating story rather than a story that's got a whole lot of baggage. So yay, Jesus transfigures and turns super white from whatever Jesus was before. And that helps us know that God will come to us and name and claim us and is willing to be mobile towards what our needs and our thoughts are. And if you want to learn more about it, hopefully I'll finish this proof for the illustrated retelling of the Gospel according to Mark, our Bible study that doesn't suck translation of Mark that I've been working on for the last 4 years. Almost done. I'm this far into it. So hopefully by the end of the week.
I was going to publish when we were talking about it, but I think
I think I missed what you were saying because sometimes you were cutting out, Dan.
I was going to the translation there that you did, but when you were talking about the gospel earlier, but can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay. Yeah, but I figured you'd bring it up eventually, so you know, there we are.
Oh, this? You were gonna plug this? What? You mean this? This here book? What? This?
That.
And what I think is fun in so in my translation of this section, what I think is fun that's not emphasized in the current like NRSV translation is just the idea that Jesus is transforming, metamorphosizing. And because it's the same word that Jesus uses or that is used to talk about what happens when Jesus is healing people in their mind, body, and spirit. So Jesus has his own transformation in his mind, body, and spirit, whatever that means. But Jesus experiences the same kind of metamorphosis that he's calling people to do. And that word about like, repent, turn around, stop doing those things. If you want to translate it in a negative fashion, you can say repent. If you want to translate it in like a helpful fashion or like an optimistic fashion, it's like be transformed, be transformed within yourself. And to have Jesus living by that example, not publicly in front of other people, but to go off into the mountains and transform his own life and to work on his own self-awareness, I think is a pretty cool thing that we don't always think about Jesus needing to learn stuff or Jesus needing to practice what he preaches. And so this is an opportunity to think about Jesus transforming and growing, getting enough chutzpah to go out into the world and to do cool stuff.
I think this text, I agree. I think this is the timing of this is great because it comes right before Lent, and to me, Lent is a time of an opportunity, let's say, for personal transformation, right?
Yeah.
It's a chance to sort of step outside ourselves and figure ourselves out and figure out ways that we can personally grow. And we have this example of Jesus sort of doing that. The other part of this and the Elijah story that I think is sort of funny, interesting, is that they're both extremely supernatural events. Despite the fact that the Bible is a story about and in and through God, there's really not that many truly sort of supernatural events, and both of these are. And in both cases, it's sort of like here's this amazing, crazy thing that we can't understand, and the disciples try to understand it. And I think there's some permission in both of the stories. You don't worry about trying to understand it. Like, it's not about trying to figure out what this is about. Yes, there was this transformation, and yes, there was this, with Moses and Elijah. Well, that's why Elijah's in both stories, showing up. But it's okay that some stuff is just God's to understand, and we don't have to figure it out. Which I kind of like. And the disciples, Peter always tries to he tries really hard. You got to give him some credit. He
does try hard.
He's the one. He stepped out of the boat on the walking in the water. He walked on the water, and here he's like, oh well. He always talks before he thinks, kind of like me. I think. he's like, oh, let's make 3 dwelling places. And Jesus basically says, oh, Peter, you don't get it. You know, like this is this is a different thing. Like this is a bigger thing than that. But I think there's some permission there for us to sort of revel in what's going on and not have to try to figure out what it's about, which I kind of like.
Yeah, and in chapter 8, Jesus talks about like no one understands about the feeding of people and that's their responsibility to help with. And Jesus is really like annoyed that the disciples need a sign, that they need something to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And I think what's kind of cool is that it's like, I don't want to have to like prove my spot on the chain of command here, but I'm going to do it anyway because y'all aren't seeming to get this. And I like that instead of being a story where it's like, you should just believe more. Jesus is like, ugh, why don't you believe enough? Okay, fine, I'll fix it. Like, it's not like Jesus is angry and then doesn't connect with those people or says, I'm going to wait until you agree with me, right? Turn or burn, people. Jesus never says that, even if some of Jesus's followers in present day say that. But Jesus is like, ugh, you need a sign? Okay, let's go up on top of the mountain and I'll step into the light and my clothes will be gleaming fresh and my teeth will go ting like a tooth.
Yes, but how many times, and this is one of those stories, how many times does Jesus perform this huge miracle, but he only brings a few disciples and then he says, don't tell anybody, right? This is one of those times. Like there's other times when he heals somebody and there's only a couple disciples there. It always seems that, like, I love the story of the bleeding woman, the embedded story of the bleeding woman and the daughter of Jairus. And when he heals the bleeding woman, which was, sort of a public thing, and he would have been made unclean, he's sort of there in front of everybody and he acknowledges he's been touched and he doesn't seem to care. But when he goes and heals the daughter of the synagogue leader, it's just him and a couple disciples. He doesn't bring everybody. And then he tells them not to tell anybody. Like some of the most miraculous things, the most, crazy, things, he sort of says, it's not a big deal. Yeah, so he is proving his, it is giving a sign, but well, don't tell anybody. Although ironically, they must have told, they're not very good at keeping secrets apparently, because every time we have so many examples of don't tell anybody, and then we still have it in the gospel. So clearly they told somebody.
Except for the end of the story. So the whole thing is funny because he's constantly saying don't tell anybody, and then at the end of the story in the Gospel of Mark, it ends with go tell everyone.
And then it ends.
They don't know. But I think in the Gospel of Mark, there's also an interesting thing happening where Jesus heals people who can do good, faithful things in a town. And then when there's someone there who's solid, who can help the people in that area, he leaves, right? And he takes with him the people who still have more work to do. So like when Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, he makes her a deacon, and then she stays to heal all the sick, but Jesus like leaves off into the wilderness and says to the disciples, you guys probably got more learning to do. You should come with me. And so there are very solid people who understand and who get things. The difference in this story, which I can't even believe you forgot to bring this one up, Dan, because it's your favorite damn story. But it's every single time in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is like, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, except for Legion, who's smelly and annoying and everyone hates him and he's probably not behaving very well. He like hangs out in the graveyard forever. And Jesus and the guy's like, can I come and follow you? It's going to be amazing. And he's like, instead, why don't you go tell everybody what I just did? And it's the only time that happens really in the Gospel of Mark. And so we don't know if it was like, was Jesus feeling like he was prepared, that he could like hang out? It probably is a giant metaphor about the Roman army. and like the Roman army is converting, and that's kind of awkward for new Christians. The people who wanted to kill us are the ones who like are the most into Christianity now.
Or maybe, maybe because he experienced his own transformation, he understood a little bit about what he probably understood better than the disciples, at least at that moment, what Jesus was all about. And I like what your analogy about, you guys come with me who still don't understand, which is basically his disciples, because we have so many examples, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, we have so many examples of the disciples still struggling to really understand what's going on, while people that Jesus runs into for like 3 minutes understand, they get it, right? And the disciples are with him for 3 years, and at the end of 3 years, they're still sort of, I don't know what's going on here. We've seen all these miracles, but is he really the Son of God? Like it's amazing to me,
And Jairus, whose daughter gets saved when the bleeding woman is touching him, Jairus is a Pharisee, which means he's a public, faithful person. And so Jesus is not intentionally trying to embarrass Pharisees or other rabbis in public. He went to his house to have that kind of conversion experience with him. And so I think Jesus is being kind of strategic politically and with his colleagues, where he's kind of choosing, like, he always has to like explain the parables to the disciples because they never know what they're about. And so he's like, and then he took them aside in private and said, don't worry, guys, no one understands what I'm saying. So let me explain it to just you, because you're the ones who need me to explain it to you, right? So I wonder if there's like a bit of Jesus like not wanting to make people look dumb in public, even if they are acting dumb in public.
The other thing that I've sort of have made the case is that Jesus's own words and actions don't promote later Christianity. So here the gospel writers are writing about these things about Jesus, and a lot of these stories, like, don't tell anybody, almost sound like, oh, I don't want people to know about my true divinity or whatever. And using, I know this is
so humble. Aren't I so humble? Ooh,
yeah. But that's even one of the texts this week. But going back to that bleeding woman story, the story that would make even Jews of the time of the gospel writers, 100 years later, be a little off-put, a little edgy, was that, would be, here publicly he was made unclean, because they still had those cleanliness laws. It's not a good promotional tool for say, hey, look, we're following this guy who doesn't care about cleanliness laws. And the healing that is private has nothing to do with that, right? So it's I think part of the divinity of Christ is promoted by the fact that he throws those laws up in the air, and it, because it's not almost nothing that Jesus says or does is good, promotional fodder, on the surface. Like, he does things backwards from what the society then thought was right, and sometimes what the society now thinks is right. But that's the very reason why we need to follow him, to me. Ironic. Because he turns everything upside down. And I think that story, and I think even these stories today, can turn people's ideas of what God is and what Jesus is upside down. And that can be uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it wrong, right?
Yeah. I just think for most people who are reading this text about Jesus, like, having this moment, that what you might be wondering is, like, what if I don't believe this? Can I still be a Christian? Like, what if I don't believe in the virgin birth? Can I still be a Christian? Like, how many of the things that happen in this story do I have to believe in order to, like, be able to be a good Christian? And so I thought it might be helpful to share that there's this idea that the faith of previous generations of Christians echoes from the past, and that when there is a part of scripture we don't believe, like, do you literally believe Jesus turned gleaming white just like that? If you do, awesome, you're in. If you don't, then you can borrow the faith of the people in the past who believed that and, like, move on. Lutherans, we don't get points in heaven for how many people we convince of the right way of thinking, or for anything, actually. We believe that Jesus and God does all of the work that it takes to like name and reclaim us. And that gives us the opportunity to be appreciative and to take care of other people in our world without doing it out of a sense of guilt or a sense of obligation, that we do it because we can, not because we ought. And I think that if you are looking at this text and assuming that because every year in the church there's a Transfiguration Sunday day that you have to believe it or you're not allowed to come to church anymore, I just want to make sure that we've said it out loud at least one time, that your individual faith is between you and God. And if you have bits of the Bible that aren't working for you today, flip to some other pages. It's a super long book, right? Find the stories that connect to you here and now, and don't get caught up in the ones that you're like, I don't know how I feel about that, because Jesus did that. There's a portion in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is reading from the book of Isaiah, and he doesn't read it straight through. He reads the part where it's like, God is going to bring justice. Everything's going to be abundant and plenty. And then he scrolls past the part that says, and if you're terrible, God will destroy you. And then he goes to the part that says, and there will be justice for the poor, right? Like, so if even Jesus can proof text and like pick the text he liked the best to justify his own faith, then we can do that too. And I don't mean just throw away everything that challenges you and stuff that you might need to work on. But what I'm saying is, if your faith is at risk because of any of these stories, then pick stories that support your faith until you feel like you're in a place where you can wrestle with some of those harder texts.
I just heard a speaker on Saturday and Sunday this last weekend. His name is Richard Monson. He's from Augustana College.
Oh, you did?
He's awesome. It was really awesome.
Taught me Greek.
Really?
He's my favorite person on the planet.
I have to tell you what he talked about with the Genesis story another time, because it was mind blowing. But part of what he said was, look, the Bible, can we please, and this is, I know you and I are okay with this, but can we please as a faith get away from these literal excuse me.
How dare you?
The Bible is meant to be a series of stories.
Yeah.
And whether it literally happened or not is not the point.
Yeah.
And people have a hard time with that. Could the Transfiguration have actually happened as is? Sure.
Why not? God can do anything.
Could it have been totally made up by the gospel writer or somebody else?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not about
the story. Yeah.
It's not about whether it happened or not, because people are so caught up in whether it happened or not. And it's really not about that. If it helps you to read any story in the Bible and think of it in a literal sense, then great. I don't read very much of the Bible literally, personally. That doesn't mean it's not God's inspired word for my life. It still is, right? Because it goes through filters. And so you have to recognize those filters. And I think it's a disservice to all of us when we try too hard to put the gospel into a box.
Yes.
You know, this is the way it's supposed to be. And I think we all do that. You know, we who are more progressive say, well, those conservative Christians, they do that. And I think we all do that. You kind of alluded to that. Even Jesus sort of picked and chose a little bit. We all put scripture into a box to a certain degree. But that's we need to break free of trying to I don't know what the word is, sanitize it, you know, and make it look how pretty and that beautiful this story is. Realize that there's lots of perspectives on things, and the way you read something, the way I read something, the way someone else reads something might be totally different. If you have 10 preachers, if they're good preachers, and you have 10 preachers who preach over the same text, you're going to have 10 totally different sermons. Does that make 9 of them invalid?
Yes.
No. Oh. Right? Well, yours is the valid one.
No, I was just.
But I get so fed up with it, and people even in my church will say, well, and like learn to say, well, what do you think it means?
Yeah.
Or did blank happen? And I'm like, I don't know. Do you think it happened? Because it's not about whether it happened or not, and it's all about our own experience, our own interpretation of it. And so, there are things in the Bible that are sort of supernatural that I have a hard time thinking of as literal, right?
Yeah.
And there are things that are told in the Gospels and other places that I think, oh, that probably happened just as it was.
Yeah.
But that's my own decision. And I try to leave it up to even people in my church to make their own decisions about those things. But yeah, like you said, it's not.
Oh, there you are. You came back. Yay!
Did you not hear me?
Yeah, I heard you, but it just sometimes bunches together in time and then comes out faster.
Oh, man. Hopefully it's not a bad connection. Anyway, I that's one of the hardest things for me, even for people in my congregation, is this. What does this mean, or what should I think this is true? This actually happened. I think that's the wrong question to ask.
Yeah.
I think it's what does this mean to you? Not what did it happen.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway.
It's too late to prove it either way anyway. Right? It's been a lot of years.
Time
not really good forensic evidence still floating around in Ziploc baggies somewhere. But
we're gonna get time machines.
Yeah. One of the things that I write in here is that it's because I enjoyed my classes with the Reverend Dr. Richard Swanson so much, I can no longer tell which things I heard from in class and which are my imagined conversations in the back of my head. And so if there is something that I say that is smart, that's probably his idea. And if there's something I say that's completely wrong, that totally was me. And so he's someone I have such great kind of love and admiration for, and I'm so excited to have been able to study with him. And if you spend time with him, you'll see where that origin came within myself. So it's good stuff. I'm glad you got to hang out with him.
Now you said this, I have to I'm just going to go with it. We've had so many side texts. Anyway, we brought in about 8 different side texts. I'm bringing one more side text just to throw at people. He said, part of the creation story says he made them male and female.
Oh yeah.
Before Eve was created, he made them male and female.
Yeah.
And then the Greek word that's translated rib is not rib, it's side, as in half of.
That's right.
So he made the earthling, the groundling, male and female, and then divided the groundling in half.
Mm-hmm.
That alone changes the whole story for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's I call it the first sexual reassignment surgery.
That's great.
And the rabbis used to think of it as, they didn't just think of it as like a man and a woman being cut down the middle, but they thought that sometimes that male female got divided this way or that way, and so it might be like a woman and a man. But the idea is like Jerry Maguire, you complete me, right?
Yeah.
That come together and they are one. It wasn't about parts and wholes like some people think it was. And it actually was a story that was about Gilgamesh and Enkidu, 2 men, was the origin story of Adam and Eve. So it really was Adam and Steve, not Adam and Eve, the first version. It just got retold through time.
Well, and here's a little bit of an irony about the whole thing. The early Jewish scholars, and I mean pre-Jesus Jewish scholars, understood that.
Yep.
Like, we perverted it.
Yep.
Now, like they were okay with the idea of God created a male and female, and this whole, like, we've bastardized it after thousands of years. It's kind of ironic. Let's go back.
I don't know if I bragged about this yet, but one of the really cool things that happened to me this year is that during the Reformation 500 celebration in Germany at Martin Luther's house, let me grab the book really quick. There was an exhibit of 95 people who they thought followed in the footsteps of Martin Luther and did kind of cool things. And one of those people is this person right here.
Yeah.
And they put a copy of Queerly Lutheran, which is a book I wrote in 2009. It's basically like the essays that I wrote in seminary. And they also had a video of our Bible study that doesn't suck hanging up in Martin Luther's house in Wittenberg. And it was a video that I did talking about trans stories, and particularly talking about that particular idea of people being whole and then being separated. And as a part of that, I talked about how Martin Luther believed that if God is the one who saved you, if God is the one who declares that you are saved and loved by God, then arguing anything else, saying that there's anything about your being or about your choices in the world, if you argue that anything can separate you from the love of God after Jesus already declared that we were saved, then it's the equivalent of calling God a liar. And that was what Luther argued, so that he would stop people from like collecting points and being able to do that. And so this is, I don't think I've bragged about this yet, but it was really, really touching to me that happened. It was, and thank you, Wittenberg people, if you watch these. But so I'm in Wittenberg. I go to Martin Luther's house. They have a book with me in it, right? About like 95 people who were influenced by Luther. I go home to my hotel and I'm like, wow, that was so moving. Like, never in my life. Like, this is like, I never imagined something like that could ever happen. And it's just so beautiful that I got to like experience part of it. So I go back to the hotel and my Facebook blows up, right? With like, just like maybe 300 messages or something like that, like you do. And it was the moment that Cosmo had put out that video about me, about trans stuff and faith. And so it was such a surreal day to like go to Martin Luther's house and be in an exhibit and then go back to your hotel and have like Cosmo magazine in New York feature you on Facebook. And it's like such a weird balance between like mass media attention and like obscure church history nerds liking you. But so the reason that I share that is that if you're like, yeah, but you're just some progressive pastor in San Francisco, like you're just trying to like justify yourself in your own life. And that's why you have these progressive Bible studies, but no one else really agrees with you. And my own community could never agree with me and the choices that I make in my life. And that would never play in other parts of the space. Like, I don't know. Like, I think it's catching on, right? I think the fact that God's love is bigger than our dumb, naughty and nice list is, first of all, an old idea. And second of all, it's catching on. And so if people in Germany can watch these Bible studies that doesn't suck and hang them up in Luther's house, then, you know, it can, if you're someone who needs that kind of authority to like know that loving yourself is okay and allowed by God, then there you go. I took my moment of non-humility to just.
I think this idea that progressive Christianity, I almost don't like the word progressive Christianity, because to me it's just Christianity. This idea of this ultra conservative Christianity is really a pretty new concept in the history of the world. Like, you know, like even if we look at what early communities were like right after Christ, and even through some of not always the best times of Christianity, people understood the basic idea of Christianity is loving your neighbors, loving each other, is taking care of each other. And we haven't always had high points, like I said, like the crusade and things like that, right? But ultimately, this idea of exclusion has only been, you know, who's in and who's out has only been the last, you know, 75 years or so. So, or, you know, or 100
Except
years.
for the times when they were like murdering people.
Well, yeah. Like
blah,
to say,
blah, the Inquisition, blah, blah, Constantine, blah, blah, Marcion, blah, blah, creeds, blah, blah, trying to kill Martin Luther.
yeah.
Blah, blah.
We've always failed at it too.
Good. May our terrible theology never catch on. Well, thank you everyone who's participated in our Bible study. Hopefully we didn't go on so many tangents that you got lost. My hope is that regardless of which Bible texts speak to you, you know that God names and claims you, and that you'll know that when people say that God couldn't possibly love someone like you, that they are most certainly liars. So take care, everybody.
Yep.
Yep.